I think I probably don't have that many cricket fans in my audience, so you may not be familiar with the name Shane Warne. But if you are a cricket fan, then you very much do know the name, and you've probably been deeply affected, as the entire cricketing world has, by the sudden and shocking death of a 52-year-old guy who, while it's always difficult to quantify such things, he might have been the best-known athlete in the world who isn't a soccer player. And though this might be presumptuous of me, I think that if I were to say Shane Warne was the greatest living Australian up until the time of his death on Friday, not many Australians would argue the point. How loved is this guy in Australia? 2 words. State funeral. He's getting a state funeral, which I believe is the second state funeral for an Australian cricketer after the one they gave for Sir Donald Bradman in 2001. Can you picture any American athlete getting a state funeral? Because me either. In fact, it was the death of Don Bradman back in 2001 that started me on my on-again, off-again quest to one day understand the game of cricket. I knew some English guys and some Australian guys through the AC/DC news group. For the youngsters in the audience, news groups were how you argued with people online back before social media existed. And on the day that Bradman died, these guys were all completely gutted by it. It was the only thing they wanted to talk about that day. They were all deeply offended that we Yanks and Canadians didn't have any idea who Sir Donald Bradman was. Eventually, the discussion devolved into a baseball versus cricket sort of sectarian pissing match, as these things often do. But later, in a private discussion with one of the Australian guys, he extracted a promise from me that I would make a serious attempt at understanding the game of cricket before I presumed to slander it any further. And I've spent 21 years now trying to deliver on that promise. Every few years I'll try again. Each time I make a little bit more progress, but there always comes a point where I get frustrated and give up. So it's kind of weird that Shane Warne picked right now to have a sudden fatal heart attack, because as it happens, I've just been in the midst of one of those trying to understand cricket periods, and I had just recently become a big fan of this guy. I don't think it's correct to call him the Australian Babe Ruth, because Bradman was the Australian Babe Ruth. Bradman got a knighthood and a state funeral, by the way, and Warren was a bowler anyway, so it's more apropos to say that he's the Australian Cy Young or the Australian Walter Johnson, if you like. But in terms of what makes him a beloved figure on the level of a national hero who gets a state funeral, I think the best comparison among U.S. athletes, maybe not athletes, let's say sportsmen, is probably John Daly. Except John Daly with consistency to match his talent. In both cases, you've got a schlubby, pudgy guy. He's always one sandwich away from being fat. Nothing about his outward appearance suggests a world-class pro athlete. He drinks like a fish. He smokes like a chimney. He runs around on his wife. He cheats on his taxes. In the content of his personal habits and life choices, he's the last guy you would ever call a role model. But when he's on the field of play, there is one skill he does better than anybody else possibly ever. With John Daly, he could hit the ball 50 yards farther on average than any tour player ever had up to that point. With Shane Warne, he mastered and repopularized a dead art called leg spin bowling, or leg spin bowling, if you speak Australian, which is basically the cricket equivalent of being a crafty curveball pitcher instead of a flame-throwing fastball guy. But as a sportsman, you don't get to the level of a national hero and demigod, the kind of guy who's so widely admired that they raise statues to him in his own lifetime, just by being a lovable oaf who's really absurdly good at some specialized skill on some field of athletic competition. There are still 2 more ingredients that are missing. The first is that you have to shine most brightly on the biggest, most important stages. And the second is making the people love you by being one of them. Barry Bonds will never get a state funeral. Tom Brady will never get a state funeral. Shane Warne is getting a state funeral, not just because he took the most test wickets in history and is arguably the greatest bowler ever, but because he achieved that greatness while also being completely unaffected by wealth and notoriety. If you wanted to know where this guy was a half hour after the match ended, he was probably down the pub pounding some beers with some of the fans. This was a guy who never turned down an autograph seeker, never said no to an interview request. He seemed to enjoy nothing more than sitting and talking about his sport. So he is also a sports writer's dream. Just turn on the tape recorder, ask the guy an opening question. He'll talk as long as you want him to. And it seems weird now. I was just watching this new Shane Warne documentary on Amazon Prime. I think it just came out a few weeks ago. And I was thinking that in that aspect of his character, he reminded me a lot of Tony Gwynn. And it's too bad that they have also both perished now at a stupidly young age. But the way you treat the customers and the way you treat the people whose job it is to cover your profession, that stuff counts for a lot. It counts for a whole hell of a lot. And we're starting to be living in a world now where it's impossible to become a hero and a legend on that sort of level anymore. The level of knighthoods and state funerals and public esteem and esteem that becomes actual genuine love. Because now all public figures are expected to have a political position, to take a side on every issue of the day, to mouth all the correct catchphrases at regular intervals so the woke sports media don't start suspecting them of indulging unapproved, heretical thoughts. I bet you didn't tune in tonight expecting to hear 5 minutes about a dead cricketer, did ya? But in seriousness, to my Australian friends, if any are watching, I do wish to extend my condolences on the passing of Mr. Warne. He was a credit to his sport and a credit to his nation, and he will be missed. Jim Legal, let's have a silent open tonight for the Australians. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I will show you my googly if you show me your leg stump. I guess that's my official first cricket joke. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And you know how you can tell a sane country with sane leaders from a country that isn't like that? In a sane country with sane leaders, when you get slapped across the face with the long cock of reality, when events unfold in such a way that your policies are exposed, unequivocally, categorically as bad, awful, wrong-headed policies which have failed to achieve their desired effect, indeed which have achieved the opposite of their desired effect. In a country with leaders like that, the leaders say, would you look at that? It looks like our policies have failed. In fact, it looks like our policies are having effects that are both unforeseen and really quite disastrous. Ergo, this seems like it would be a good time to reverse those policies and start doing the opposite of the thing we've been doing. The Germans seem to have learned this lesson in a really big damn hurry, which is a shame because they could have come to me 15 years ago when they first decided, oh yeah, let's unplug all the nuclear reactors and replace them with solar and wind power. What could go wrong? And I could have said, look here, Fritz. That's just about the shittiest fucking idea I've ever heard before, and I live in California, so I've heard more shitty ideas than most people. But sometimes, sadly, world leaders do not solicit one's opinion when they really would behoove themselves to do so. Sometimes, countries decide to go down the path of shaping their long-term energy policy around the principles of, okay, let's just not make that angry Swedish teenager any angrier, or else she might yell at us on Twitter. So we must be doing the right thing if that doesn't happen, yeah? But like I said, Germany seems to have snapped out of it now. They've come to the realization that, yeah, the reliance on the Russian oil is maybe not so good, and maybe they were hasty in taking the nuclear power offline. So now it would seem they're going to be putting their retired reactors back online, increasing their oil and gas exploration, and generally going back to living in the real world of sane and pragmatic energy policy rather than the virtue-signaling clown world of what would Greta do. Because virtue signaling is so much fun, isn't it? Right up until the bill comes due, and the waiter just brought the check, and the waiter is freaking Vladimir Putin, because you don't even need to talk about the 1,000-year history of ethnic grievance between Russians and Ukrainians in order to understand the casus belli that really gave birth to the present war, because you can draw a big, damn, bright, thick line between climate cultist nonsense green energy policies and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. These policies put the cudgel into Putin's hand, and the soft cultural imperialism of NATO and the EU and the United States gave him more than enough motivation to start swinging the damn thing. If France and Germany never shut down their nuclear reactors, do they have any need of Russian oil right now, or any cause to help Russia build an oil pipeline? No, they do not. Consequently, would Russia and Putin have any strategic leverage over Western Europe right now that they could parlay into a surprise Ukrainian land grab? Nope. They would not. And similarly, if Joe Biden had simply done nothing on the energy policy front upon becoming president, if he had just gone upstairs and watched Murder, She Wrote and taken a nice long nap instead of sacrificing our energy independence as a burnt offering to Saint Greta, official emissary of the sun monster god, as his first act on his first day in office, aside from soiling his trousers, would Vladimir Putin have it within his power to cause you to pay any more for a tank of gasoline? Nope, he would not. Any strategic leverage that Russia possesses over the United States and Western Europe today, we willingly gave to them. And besides, for people who are always falling over themselves to tell us how much they love following the science and the data and whatnot, when you're shutting down nuclear reactors because you would rather burn Russian oil, you're doing it wrong. I'm really having a difficult time trying to fathom how you reconcile that with your stated belief that carbon emissions are bad and evil and awful and we have to reduce carbon emissions at any and all costs or else we're all doomed. Because look, I ain't no scientist, I ain't got no fancy book learning, I ain't got no fancy Ivy League degrees or nothing like that, but it seems to me that if you've got an existing mode of power generation, namely nuclear fission, that meets all of your demand requirements and produces no carbon emissions whatsoever, it seems like you would want to keep using a source like that. In fact, if my political views were informed by a genuine concern for environmentalism, if I really cared deeply about the importance of limiting carbon emissions, I think unplugging my nuclear reactors, building a bunch of ridiculous solar panel farms, blighting the natural landscape with bat-chomping, bird-slicing eco-crucifixes, and piping in a shitload of crude oil from Russia is just about the last way I would go about it. Because seriously, what the hell kind of environmentalism informs such impossibly stupid thinking? Why is nuclear bad? Will some greeniac climate cultist please explain this to me? They never tell us why it's bad. They just say it's bad, we have to get rid of it, and then when we do, they replace it with something that is far dirtier, more expensive, and less efficient. In point of fact, nuclear fission is the best, cleanest, safest option we have for large-scale power generation, and it will remain so into the foreseeable future. In over half a century, there has never been any containment incident in North America or Western Europe that resulted in death or serious injury. Opponents will always point to the Chernobyl incident as a cautionary tale against nuclear power, and while they're correct that there is a cautionary tale contained within that story, it is not a cautionary tale against nuclear power. It's a cautionary tale against freaking communism. Chernobyl melted down because the strictures of the bureaucracy were so rigid, low-level bureaucrats lived in such fear of mid-level bureaucrats, who lived in such fear of top-level bureaucrats, that in an emergency situation, which required on-the-spot decision-making, everybody who might have done something to stop it sat there and did nothing. Soviet communism had twisted these men's minds into such grotesque pretzel shapes that they were more terrified of acting without orders than they were of the goddamn reactor melting down. And Fukushima isn't a very good cautionary tale either, because, hello, maybe don't build your nuclear reactor on top of a fault line, because I don't know, it seems to me like if there was ever a major earthquake along the fault line that you built your reactor right on top of, that might not be the best thing. But again, I ain't no fancy scientist. So in the one case, you've got a failure of the political system. In the other case, you've got a failure of site selection. But in any event, irrespective of whom or what caused those two incidents, the fact that those two incidents exist is not a compelling argument for getting rid of nuclear power. If you care about emissions and climate change, Nuclear power is still the best option we have, and it is not close. The U.S. Navy has had fully nuclear-powered submarine and aircraft carrier fleets for over 50 years now. There has not been one single accident. There simply is no cleaner way of generating electricity from thin air than by nuclear fission. You could blanket the entire globe in solar panels and bat-chomping, bird-slicing eco-crucifixes and not replace the output of one nuclear plant. You would kill a hell of a lot of birds, though, so that's got to count for something, right? So what is this all about, really, you might ask? Because it clearly is not about reducing emissions, it's not about saving the planet, or whatever overblown emotional catchphrase you happen to prefer. Is this about governments trying to do right by their people? Or is it about governments using yet another crisis to advance yet another series of social engineering goals? I think the disparity in the German and American responses here furnishes us with the answer to the question. The German response has been, okay, clearly we went overboard with the climate cultism, but we see the consequences now. They're right in front of us. We see we were mistaken, and we're going to correct the mistake because we want to do right by our people and maximize their ability to freely live their lives. Sadly, though, the American response has been much more autocratic and much less pragmatic than the German response, and that's a sentence that should never exist, but that's where we are now, I guess. When they ask Mayor Pete about what can be done about runaway gasoline prices, he just shrugs and smirks and says, well, go buy an electric car, you idiot. Stop your bitching. If there's anything I can't stand, it's the sound of poor people complaining. And when they ask the same question of Lady Ginger McFirebush of Alabaster Farms, the response is only slightly less imperious and dismissive. People need to end their reliance on fossil fuel, she says, as if she's our rehab counselor and we're just a bunch of silly crackheads. The German government cares about doing right by its people. The American government does not. The German government cares about the citizens' right to self-determination. The American government does not. The American government is all too happy to take any crisis that presents itself and to use it as a weapon to force you into living the way they want you to live in a place of their choosing. The Joe Biden administration, they don't have any interest in gas prices coming down because when gas prices go up, it advances their social engineering goals. They don't want you owning your own car. They want car ownership to be something that is just for the ruling class. For you and me, they want us all to be living in high-density urban housing, and when we need to go someplace, they want us using public transportation to go there. And yes, you might get raped, but stop being so self-absorbed. They don't want the average person owning a car because when you own a car, when you can go wherever you like, whenever you want, that is less time that you're spending sitting safely in your 350 square foot studio apartment, dutifully consuming content on a streaming service owned by one of the world's 3 richest men, which you're watching on a device that you bought also from one of those same 3 men. It's really no different than the way they lie about illegal immigration. In both cases, they claim to believe one thing, they claim to be pursuing policies in support of that belief, but in reality, they believe the opposite of that thing. And the policies they pursue are designed to produce the opposite outcome of the outcome they say they want. Even as 2+ million illegal aliens ingressed the country last year, and that's just the ones we know about, the government claimed to be making a good faith effort to enforce U.S. immigration law. So in other words, this is what it looks like when you're trying? You mean to say you're enforcing the law right now just as fervently as the last administration was, but you're just this much worse at it? Because frankly, I think it would sound better if you just came out and admitted you were corrupt. Joe Biden and Lady Ginger and all of those assholes. They do not want your gas prices going down. Low gas prices don't do anything to bring their social engineering goals any closer to fruition. Low gas prices don't inflict punishment on you for the crime of owning a car and putting gas in it. Your mobility, your freedom of movement, your personal agency, it offends these people. It is an affront to their sensibilities. They get the best of both worlds this way. Gas prices skyrocket. People can't afford to drive cars anymore, which is exactly what they want, to make you less mobile and more easy to control. But this way, they get to blame the whole thing on Vladimir Putin instead of on their own malevolence. And when it's all over, they will pat themselves on the back and confidently assert that they have saved the planet from the diabolical sun monster. And this brings us to the end of this evening's proceedings. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Have a pleasant tomorrow. I will see you Friday. Until next time, do not comply. Get off my lawn.